This is Epic Book Recaps, a podcast that offers complimentary audio summaries of influential nonfiction books, making learning a smarter experience. I Hear You by Michael S. Sorensen. Validation is seen as a weakness in a world where we're asked to toughen up and take whatever life throws at us. We often see people who ask for it as being too needy. And while neediness has its place, not all validation requests are signs of neediness. This will shock you. Every one of us is asking for validation every day without even realizing it. Seeking validation is not a sign of neediness. The majority of our conversations are validation inclined. That's how we're wired to connect. A coworker telling you about her fight with her boyfriend is seeking validation, not necessarily advice. The same thing is happening when you see a car while relaxing with a friend and feel the nudge to say, "Look at that beautiful car." You probably felt you needed something like that yourself, and you needed your friend to validate the emotion. But as important as validation is, it's unfortunately a less talked about subject. Most people don't know what it means, let alone how to give and receive it. And because it's such a subconscious need, we're often requesting it without even knowing what we're asking for. But we feel it when we have a good talk with someone who understands validation. Have you had a chat with someone, maybe even a stranger, and just felt like they understood you on a deep level? And without realizing what was happening, you felt a sense of relief and satisfaction from the conversation. That's the power of validation. Remember that everyone you meet is afraid of something, loves something, and has lost something. When you know what validation is and how important it is to us, you'll start noticing requests for it in your conversations. And by that time, you'll be armed with the knowledge you need to both give and receive it. If that sounds interesting enough, then let's get started. What you're doing when validating someone is helping them realize that their thoughts and emotions are important. Validation is the act of helping someone feel heard and understood. For example, if a friend tells you that they're scared of an upcoming exam, there are two possible ways to respond. One, you could say something like, "Oh no, don't be. You'll be fine, I know it." Or you could go on to ask why they feel scared, then validate the feeling. The conversation could go something like this. What makes you scared? Friend, I haven't been studying. I can imagine. I'd feel scared too. And the conversation goes on. What you should notice is that the first reply just provided reassurance, and it's not likely that your friend came looking for that. Most people already know that fear isn't always a real thing, so they don't need a reminder. What they do need, however, is someone to carry on the conversation, as in the second scenario. In the second instance, you showed your friend that you were listening by asking why they were scared, and then went on to validate the emotion. That's the principle of validation, and that's what most people are seeking when they open up about a feeling. Don't just rush into offering solutions when people share things with you. Listen empathically first. In short, when practicing validation, there are two basic things you must do. Listen with empathy. Validate a specific emotion. There's more, but we'll consider them in full subsequently. Now that you've gotten a general idea of what validation means, let's talk about what it does not. If you're like most people, you probably grew up in an environment where validation was considered a thing for weaklings. If this is so, you will have difficulty differentiating between a sincere need for validation and extreme neediness. That's why this chapter is important. Here we will go over 3 misconceptions about validation and debunk them. After these points, you'll be better positioned to give validation. Let's start. First, validation is not only for negative emotions. When people are joyful or celebrating a milestone, validating responses help them see that you're happy for them. For example, which of the following would you prefer when you tell a spouse that you got good feedback from your boss? "That's nice, honey," or "Really? Tell me about it." It's certainly the second response. Second, You don't validate only when you agree with the person. Validation has very little to do with accepting a person's view. You can disagree with people and still validate their emotions. The two are not mutually exclusive. Third, validation is not repeating what the other person said. That's reflective listening, and it works only when used in context. The main difference between the two is that validation focuses on emotions while reflective listening focuses on what people are saying. Empathic people have the ability to understand and identify with the emotions of others. Empathy is different from sympathy. To sympathize means to see someone going through a situation, feel sorry for them, and wish they could get out of it. But to empathize is to feel the emotion together with them. In other words, sympathy observes from the outside, while empathy goes in with the person. Sympathy says, "I'm sorry you're feeling sad." But empathy says, "Ah, that's so sad." You need some level of empathy to effectively provide validation. But if you're anything like most people, expressing empathy for someone you don't have a strong emotional connection with is a tough thing to do. Use the following tips to get started. Think of them as a child. This can sound crazy, but it works. It's easy to tell an adult to man up, but you can't look a 4-year-old in the eye and say the same thing. Emotions can be mesmerizing, so it doesn't make sense to tell an adult to just swallow their feelings if you can't tell a child the same thing. Become curious. You do this by asking questions to identify where their emotion is coming from. It may not even be from the current event. Often, all events do is trigger past emotions that have been buried deep in our minds. For example, feelings of insecurity in a relationship could simply be because the person was cheated on in the past. Practice identifying your own emotions. We often can't tell how we feel off the bat without taking the time to study our feelings. But when you become mindful about identifying your own emotions, it becomes easier to see those feelings in others. And this makes you more empathic. As you practice these tips, look out for hints people give when they want to open up. They may call, text, or walk up to you and say something like, "Do you have time to talk? I just need someone to talk to," or something along those lines. Invite them to open up when you see these hints. Sometimes the clue might even be nonverbal. For example, noticing that a colleague often gets lost in thought is a good sign. We've talked about validation and empathy. What's left now is giving advice or reassurance when needed. That's the next chapter. After listening with empathy and validating the other person's feelings, it might be the right time to give feedback or advice as appropriate. In some cases, people don't come for advice. They just want to vent, feel validated, and leave. People in such situations already know what to do next, so they don't need your advice. But how can you tell when someone needs advice and when they don't? It can be hard, but these tips will help. Ask what they want from you. Say something like, "How can I help?" And watch their reply. Those who want advice will ask for it straight away. But when they tell you they've got it figured out, then you know they don't need help in that area. Ask for permission. The second method is to ask if it's okay to share your thoughts. "Ah, that's awful. Can I tell you what I think?" Of course, there are exceptions to the rule. For example, you don't need permission to teach your kids how to behave. You also don't need to ask before defending yourself when accused. From the type of conversation, you'll know if you need to ask for permission or not. What matters most when giving feedback is not the content, but the manner of approach. Here are a few things to avoid when replying to a person in need of validation. Avoid being direct. Instead of saying, "You were wrong yesterday," say, "I feel what you said yesterday was wrong." Don't use buts. That word will ruin your effort, so try to find a way around it. For example, don't say, "You're such a hardworking person, but..." Avoid absolutes. These are terms like always and never. We often use them to describe a habit. For example, "You always come late to work." The problem with absolutes is that they are not always accurate, and they make people on the receiving end feel bad about themselves. On a general note, most conversations end at the advice stage. But you can take it a notch higher by revalidating the person's feelings before leaving them. Something like, "Hey, my sincere condolences again. It's really not easy to lose a spouse. Did you know?" A recent Harvard research confirms that being yourself will make you more successful at work than trying to fit in. As you know, no person is an island. We all need people and the contributions they can make to our lives. As you live your everyday life, things will happen in and around you that will prompt the need for validation. These events could be either positive or negative. That's why it's so important that you have people around you that can share in your up and down moments. These could be friends, your partner, mentors, parents, or colleagues. One or two persons that you can trust and share anything with are okay. Some people have more in their lives, but the average person has just one or two persons they're close to. When friendship matures, people are able to interpret the emotions of their friend, even before the friend opens their mouth to talk about it. So here's what to do when you sense a need for validation. Step 1. Try to meditate so you can better understand the emotions you're feeling. Step 2. Contact someone you can talk to. You could meet them in person or speak to them over the phone. When you start talking, let them know what you're feeling. Also, tell them you reached out because you need some validation. If you don't want advice, it's a good idea to tell them beforehand to avoid getting irritated when they start giving it. This is especially true when the person in question is new to the principles of validation. Learn to validate yourself. No matter how someone cares for you, they can't be with you every moment of the day. They won't always understand you either. As such, it's critical that you learn to validate yourself. Self-validation is not different from what you do when validating someone else. Recall the basic principle. Understand the emotion you're feeling, then refuse to judge yourself for feeling it. Let's imagine you just finished working on a project that took months to complete. You feel so proud of yourself, but a voice in your head is telling you to stop blowing your trumpet. What do? You've already identified the emotion as pride. Now proceed to tell yourself why you deserve to feel proud of the accomplishment. You can even add a little celebration as a way to further validate the emotion you feel. Validation can feel like a difficult thing to do, but in this summary, we've distilled it into 4 easy steps. First, listen with empathy, then validate the emotion, whether you agree with them or not. Step 3, provide feedback, advice, or reassurance if appropriate. And step 4, revalidate the emotion. While we've made it this simple, it's still possible to slip during your first attempts, but with practice, you'll become good at it. Something important to note. You'll mistakenly give advice when people didn't ask for it because that's how we've been trained to behave. But when that happens, simply apologize for offering unsolicited advice and move on with listening and providing validation. It may even turn out that the person needed your advice, and if they didn't, your apology would make them feel better. The validation principles discussed in this summary have been proven to work over and over again, but that doesn't mean they will always make people feel better. You may apply them to the wrong situation, or it may be that the person you're talking with is simply unreactive. But those are often the exceptions, so don't be discouraged. Now that you understand validation, it won't be difficult to notice your own need for it. You have 2 options when this need arises. You could contact a friend or provide validation for yourself as you would for a close friend. If you choose to contact a friend and they aren't familiar with the principles of validation, simply explain what you want from them. "Hey buddy, I feel frustrated and just want to vent. I'm not looking for advice or feedback. I'd just like you to hear me out."